Hello and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Maddie Dimmick, the Marketing Specialist here at Core Business Solutions. To avoid wasting time and money as you prepare for CMMC certification, it is important to understand your starting point. A self-assessment is a great tool that can reveal your organization's strengths and gaps that are needed to be closed. The challenges with a self-assessment are to have a good understanding of what is required and how well your systems and operational practices match up. We will cover all these aspects today. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for promoting this event today. We have numerous MEP and PTACs, who are now known as Apex Accelerators, co-sponsoring our webinar today. Your local Apex Accelerators are available to bridge the gap between your business and the government. Apex Accelerators are here to assist you with local, state, and federal contracting. MEPs provide the tools and resources to help U.S. manufacturers succeed. Each center connects manufacturers with government agencies, universities, and research facilities, and trade associations that foster growth and innovation. Contact your local Apex Accelerator or MEP for more information on how they can help your business succeed. We have two industry experts on CMMC here with us today. Scott Dawson is president of Core Business Solutions and has headed up the development of Core's cybersecurity programs for NIST, CMMC, ISO 27001, and other compliance requirements. Rick Crick is the Director of Security Solutions here at Core and has been keeping up with all the latest changes and updates to CMMC to share those with you today. Thank you both for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Well, we'll dive right in. To set the stage, Scott, could you briefly explain a little bit what Controlled Unclassified Information, or as it's known, CUI, what it is and how this applies to companies working with the DoD?
Yeah, Maddie, thank you for that. CUI refers to federal contract information that is unclassified that also requires special protection. So it's not classified information, but it is sensitive. It's things like technical drawings or specifications, sometimes intellectual property or financial information, or personally identified information. Those are some examples. And companies that are doing work with the Department of Defense, either as a prime contractor or subcontractor, they have to protect CUI from unauthorized access or data breaches. And there are certain regulations, requirements, standards that have to be met, which we're going to go over some of those here today. The current regulations are found in the DFARS clauses of federal contracts. One of them is 252.204-7012. Then there's 7019, 7020, three different clauses. And we've talked about those in recent webinars. And in the future, there will be a new regulation that refers to CMMC 2.0 certification. CMMC is not today a regulation. It's not today in contracts. So formal certification is what's not in place, but all those other regulations are in place. And it's important that you're really clear about that as you're working with the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rick, where are the specific security requirements found that companies need to follow to be in compliance with DFARS and CMMC?
Great question. They are found in the NIST SP 800-171. That contains 110 requirements that have to be met in order to protect the CUI, the controlled unclassified information that the government wants you to protect. The 110 controls are basically a one, maybe two sentence statement. For example, 3.1.18 says control connection of mobile devices. And again, in 3.2.1 it says ensure personnel are trained to carry out their assigned information security-related duties and responsibilities. So you have this requirement, and in some sense, it's a little ambiguous because it doesn't tell you how to apply that control. It doesn't tell you what you need to put in place as far as technology is concerned. nor does it give you an indication of what the assessor is going to look for. So there's a lot left to interpret here. Fortunately, they have another document that we'll be talking about a little later on here.
Good. I think we all need a bit more clarification. But today we're discussing how to do a self-assessment for NIST and CMMC. But it seems maybe we should start off with just a simple definition of what an assessment is. Scott, could you provide us with that definition for an assessment?
Yeah, sure can, Maddie. This definition is from NIST, and I'm just going to read it out here. It's just a single sentence. An assessment is the testing or evaluation of security controls to determine the extent to which controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome with respect to meeting the security requirements for a system or organization. Okay, so what are they really talking about? They're saying that an assessment is to check to see that you've done things correctly. Of course, that assumes you know what correct is. So that was part of that ambiguity that Rick was referring to. So you've got to know whether it's implemented correctly. Then an assessor will look to see if it's operating properly, so it's doing what it should do and getting the right outcome. So as you dive deeper into what an assessor does with these statements, these single sentence statements, they will dig in deeper. And so, and a third party assessor, say, for example, whether that's an assessor for a certification or other purpose, they would want to know, is it working properly? Is it getting the right results? Those type of things. So if you want to do a self-assessment in a similar manner that a third-party assessor would do it, you've got to look as if you're looking through their eyes. You've got to know what their understanding is and what they're going to interpret when they're reading these particular requirements. Fortunately, as Rick said, there are definitely more resources to look at.
Yeah. So like we said earlier, NIST 800-171 is very vague. Rick, can you tell us, like you were alluding to earlier, where companies can find more details on what's required and what assessors will look for?
Sure. That would be in a document titled NIST SP 800-171A.
Okay.
That is where we get a little bit more information, and in fact, that's where the assessors get some of their information for doing an assessment. Now, the interesting thing about this is that they take those 110 controls, and then they break them up into sections, which we would call the assessment objectives, and there's 320 of those. So each one of the 110 have multiple sections. So if we go back to our example where we were looking at the 3.1.18, you'll be able to see in that example it has the statement, control connection of mobile devices. And then they have an A, B, and C, which breaks that down into a little bit more information. So we're talking about, in the A, mobile devices that process, store, and transmit CUI that are identified. Mobile devices in B talk about those that are authorized. So we have identified, authorized, and then C, it says mobile devices connections are monitored and logged. So not only do we have to identify them, authorize them, we have to monitor the activity associated with that. So it kind of breaks down that sentence that we had earlier into components that you can audit, assess, if you will. And then there is the method that the assessors would use. Comes in three parts. It's the examine, interview, and test. So there's three ways that they can look at this control to determine whether or not you're meeting that control or you're not meeting it. So an examine might be, I would look at some of the policies or procedures associated with this. When I'm looking at interview, I would be interviewing an individual to see if they understand what the requirement is. testing might be having a mobile device that is not being authorized being attached to your network. So that's kind of a test that it shouldn't be able to connect to your network.
Yeah.
So those are some possible ways that an assessor would look at this particular control. If you go to another example that we have, that would be the, let's see, let me go, the 322, which is dealing with training. Once again, that says ensure that personnel are trained to carry out their assigned information security related duties and responsibilities. Once again, a little vague. So what they do is they look at this and break it down into three components, A, B, and C again. And it says information security related duties, roles, and responsibilities are defined. So we're defining those. The B talks about the responsibilities, roles, and responsibilities are assigned to the designated person. So we're assigning those. And then once again, we're making sure that the training was adequate for them.
Yeah.
So then we keep going, we go through that step again, examine, interview, test, and it follows that same scenario. Who do we talk to? What records can I examine? And, the testing aspect, maybe it's, have you gone through some testing? Where's that pass-fail record?
Yeah.
So if I don't complete a training, does it show up on my record that it's not completed? So some possible ways that they would handle that as they move forward in this scenario here.
Yeah.
Hey, X, would you put that last screen back up, the one on 3.2.2? I wanted to point something out for those who are in the session who've done ISO auditing in the past, internal auditing or something. You'll pick up on something that can be a clue on how to do an assessment. Rick pointed out, if you go back to English grammar class, you would look for the verbs in the sentence, right? So that first one says defined, then assigned, and then adequately trained would be the verbs in those three sentences. So if you were an ISO auditor and you were auditing an ISO standard or this standard, you would put the word how in front of those verbs and you'd make a question. So how are those, in this case, training duties, roles, responsibilities defined? How are they assigned to people? And how are people adequately trained? So it kind of brings you past the words into action and gives you a way to interview, if you're going to use that test, to dig in. And I think you can use the actual words in that document as a great aid.
Yeah.
Now, there's another document that's really helpful that even takes it a step further if you want more practical examples, because this is still a little bit high level. And that's called the CMMC Assessment Guide. Now, that document is not published by NIST. It's actually published by the Department of Defense. And I believe it is. Rick, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but it's not a NIST document. I know that. And it's called an assessment guide. And we can put a screenshot of that up. I think we were going to do that next. Nope, maybe in a bit. But it kind of is a companion to 171A, but it digs in further. So it spells out what documents you might need to see, what you might need to observe, what demonstrations you might need to have. And I think the key part of that guide, which is also used by CMMC assessors, is that it says that the controls are either met, not met, or not applicable. There's only three possibilities. Let's take not applicable off the table because I think that's going to be rare. So either it's met or it's not met. And what that means is you have to demonstrate that all of the assessment objectives for that requirement are in fact in place in order to call it met. So you can't get 2 out of 3. It's not a majority. You don't get to grade on a curve. It's basically 100% of those pieces have to be in place in order for you to consider that control to be met. And And to me, that's a big eye opener for a lot of people because they might read quickly over the one sentence and say, oh, we have training, no problem.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what they're really asking. They're asking more than that. So you got to dig in.
Yeah. Wow, that grading sounds pretty tough. Right, Scott?
Yeah, it really is. It really is, Maddie.
I would not want to take that test. But Scott, what else is in the CMMC assessment guide? I think you wanted to walk through some of the actual images from it.
Yeah, let's bring up the 3.1.18. So we're going to go back to the mobile device connection requirement that we saw earlier. And here you're going to notice, so that's the requirement in the assessment guide. And now we're looking at it. I'm sorry, it was first in the CMMC or the 171A. I'm confusing myself. So if you guys are confused, you're with me. So this is now, we're looking at a page out of the assessment guide. And the assessment guide breaks it down into further discussions and examples and potential assessment considerations and other pieces there. And you'll notice this further discussion. I really like the further discussion section because it just brings out practical examples that you can look for. It's not saying that this is how you have to do it. They're just trying to give an assessor who maybe isn't familiar with the technologies and the methods some idea of what to look for and what to ask while they're looking at it. And I think we have another screen shot of the 3.2.2, the one on training. Again, it breaks it down into some very, very specific explanations. And I just find this document plus 171A, put those two together, and you really have the information you need to be well prepared to do an assessment as you go forward.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And we will send out links in our follow-up email today to both the NIST 800-171A and the CMMC, the guide right there that Scott was just talking about. So don't worry, we'll get you all those links. But these documents provide a lot of information on each of the 110 requirements, including what the assessor would look for and ideas for preparing the assessment like you guys talked about. But let's talk about self-assessments for a little bit. Rick, can you tell us a little bit more about what is a self-assessment?
Yes, I can. A self-assessment is an organization basically walking through all 110 controls, keeping in mind the 320 controls that are there, and they're going to be determining whether or not we're meeting those controls.
Yeah.
And it's important that we define or we explain how we're meeting that control, because that's going to be part of the self-assessment process and providing you with a document at the end.
Yeah.
So they'll look at each one of these controls. They'll say, yeah, I have met it, partially met it, plan to meet it, describe what they're doing today, and then it's important that they say, what do I plan to do in the future? If this isn't being met, you know, what do I plan to do? And to put a date associated with that. Don't leave it open-ended, because if it's open-ended, nobody ever gets to it.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's important to walk your way through all 110, and then you end up with a system security plan, which is one of the requirements to be compliant to the NIST 800-171. So once again, you can do it yourself as an organization. Sometimes that's a heavy lift for them. So a lot of times people hire consultants like CORE to come in and help them understand the controls, because some of the language is a little difficult to wrap your hands around. So sometimes a consultant can give you a little bit more insight as you're walking through those controls one by one.
So that kind of answers a little bit my next question of who can do the self-assessment. Do you need an assessor? But do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Like,
yeah, it does kind of answer that. So once again, the who,
Yeah.
Like I said, anybody from the company could do it, provided they have training, an understanding of the requirements. They would need a little bit of technical background
Yeah.
in order to understand how we're going to implement maybe a group policy, or how do I configure a firewall, or a number of things that are more technical
Yes.
involvement there. Also, they want to know a little bit about the organization, because there are organizational controls, i.e. policies. So they need to help craft those policies. So somebody that's well-rounded within the company, they understand the company dynamics, they understand the requirements, they have a little bit of information about the technologies. So while anybody in the company could do that, sometimes it's hard to find somebody with that kind of background.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of times people enlist consultants to give them a hand,
Yeah.
because they specialize in that.
Hey, Rick, can I just jump in and
Sure.
add one bit of flavor to that? And I guess a little bit of a warning. And Rick, you shouldn't take Rick's advice about training lightly, because let's presume that you want to get after your self-assessment. You want to jump on it. You'd really like to see where you stand with regard to CMMC or NIST compliance. And so you kind of jump right into it. You kind of push your way through quickly. And then you determine, oh, we have something in place for that, so we must be fine. Or this we don't have in place, we're going to have to do some work. Or in this one we don't have in place, we're going to have to spend some money. And so you can envision that you're going to conclude certain actions that need to be taken, or non-actions that you're going to take, based on your presumption that you understand the requirement and that you understand how the company may or may not be implementing it. What you don't want to do is fool yourself at that point. You don't want to conclude the wrong thing, because you could end up skipping over something that really needs to be addressed. You could end up spending money on things that maybe you don't need to go down that path of spending a lot of money. And the root of it, if you think of it from a quality perspective, we're quality consultants, so we think that way. You go to the root cause, and the root cause was misunderstanding of the requirement. And we're trying to forewarn you that it could be very expensive if you go down this path quickly. You just take a light approach to it, and then the real assessment occurs. It could really cause some difficulty. And by the way, you may end up paying for a second assessment. So it's time. It really is important to do it right and get the help if you need it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of mentioned before about the real assessment, and that can be expensive, and wanting to prepare really well for it. Could you give us some examples on what you mean by that?
Well, yeah, there is that self-assessment where you want to do an adequate job in going through and evaluating the controls and what your status is, because there is always that possibility that the DoD will conduct a medium or high-level assessment on your company.
Yeah.
Therefore, when they come in, depending whether it's a medium or high-level assessment, they're going to be looking for artifacts. They're not going to be looking at words on a piece of paper. So they want you to show and verify that you're meeting this particular control. And so it goes into a little bit more detail. So that's why you want to do due diligence.
Yeah.
You don't want to falsify any of the information. And because that will lead you into another whole issue with the DoD that you don't want to go to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Maddie, an example of that, just to drill in, is that requirement on training that said, you have to get training in place. And if you quickly just say, we have training, we do phishing training, or we do how to use your computer training, or other kinds of training. Well, yeah, we're fine. We have training. But if you don't look at, as I mentioned earlier, the verbs in the sentence of those objectives that we pointed out earlier, you would not be prepared to show, have you defined the roles and responsibilities of employees with regard to cybersecurity? Have you designated what training they need? Where can I see the training plan? Whose name is assigned to what? And then, do we have records of what training has been delivered? It's not that, oh, we had everybody in the conference room and we had a meeting and everyone was there, therefore we were fine. Well, no, do you have records of that? And what was the outcome of that? So that's just one simple example where you could quickly go through it and convince yourself you're good, and then find out later that you don't have near the amount of detail that you need. It's really important to go through it that way.
Yeah. Rick, you kind of answered this next question I had about who in your organization can do the self-assessment. You said it could just be anybody who has a good understanding of the organization and technical controls. But I guess how familiar does that person have to be with NIST and CMMC?
Yeah, in my opinion, they have to be very familiar with it. They really need to have gone through some kind of training to understand what the controls really meant. Because if you look at it at face value, it kind of goes with what Scott was saying. You might look at it at face value and say, oh yeah, we've done that.
Yeah.
But really, you haven't.
Yeah.
You know, because you misunderstood what they were asking for. And maybe you didn't look at the, you know, assessment objectives. Or even if you do look at the objectives, the assessment objectives, and you might say, okay, there are 6 of them. You know what, I meet 4 or 5 of those, 1, not so much, but I'm going to give them credit because I have most of those met. No, it's not being met. It's every one of those elements that have to be met for that. So you do need to know the requirements. You need to understand those. I know within our core system we have a training that goes with that for each and every one of the controls that tries to break it down into plain English for our clients. And that's very helpful to go through that particular training to understand that. And there's other trainings as well, but you do want to be trained. You can't say, oh, yeah, I read the requirements, I'm good to go. It's a little bit more than that.
Yeah, very good point. So then, Scott, I have another question for you. Could you give us maybe some more tips on how to prepare even before doing a self-assessment?
Yeah, let's kind of take it step by step.
Yeah.
First, the training. It's vitally important you have a resource available, whether it's a public course, whether it's reading, or whether it's online training like what's in our core platform. And really study and understand the information that's in NIST 800-171A and the CMMC self-assessment. Then I'd get those 2 documents and lay them side by side. By the way, they're free, Maddie, so that's kind of nice.
I like that.
The only thing that's part of this whole thing that's free. But this webinar is free, so there's that, right?
Yeah.
But I would take them side by side, read, the first one, 3.1.1, then look at 3.1.1 in the assessment guide and see what the assessment objectives are and what the assessment methods are. So those are the 2 things you're looking for in that document. Then go to the assessment guide. I hope I'm not getting it all confused. And read further about practical examples of what you might look for or how it might be implemented. And then kind of frame your questions you're going to ask as you go through the assessment. So you kind of prepare one by one. If there are company policies, documented policies, or system diagrams or other information available relating to those requirements, then read those. Most companies that are just starting out don't have that kind of documentation, but if there is documentation, be sure you read it because that's part of the artifacts. Rick was talking earlier about artifacts of evidence that you're going to have to produce. And so if they're already prepared, you have to read those, making sure that they're meeting the requirements as well. But this is, unfortunately, it's time consuming to do these assessments. We're just talking about preparing and not even conducting the assessment or writing up a report afterward. This is why people ask for help, especially small companies that don't have a security professional available to look over things. It's important that you do it right. Otherwise, you really could waste a lot of time and money.
Yeah. So, Rick, I think it would be helpful if you could maybe show us an example of what some of this preparation looks like.
Okay, through our tool?
Through our tool, yes.
Through our tool. Okay, yeah, we have a tool that we use to help individuals meet the requirements, to become familiar with it. You can see our tool here up on the screen. And there are a lot of pieces to this. The first part we have here is we allow for a schedule. So we can develop a schedule and keep everything on track. Maybe we have a certain timeline that we have in place. And then within this, we have certain tasks that would be assigned at different points within the process. Each week, we have a set of tasks that we have to do. And so we're not trying to do it all at one time.
Yep.
We take it in little chunks so that we can digest that and understand what's going on. So we have the ability to schedule our activities. And then also the nice thing I like about it is that we have a status report that we can give to management showing, this is our progress, this is when we finished these particular sections within the application. So that's always nice to have to keep track of. And then we have the actual tool itself, and I'm going to open that up here. And here's our tool, and you'll notice it has all 110 controls. The 110 controls are in 14 families. So each family has a set of controls. In the case of 3.1, there's 22 controls. And we were looking earlier at 3.118. And I can open that up, and you can see a lot of different parts here to this. Once again, we break things down into both technical and organizational controls. This in particular is a technical control. You see that it has a weighted value of 5, but more important, here you see the description or the title, a one-liner that we talked about earlier, and we can assign it to a person to be responsible for that. In addition, you see here we have the status. We're saying, we think we have this in place. And when we look at it, there's a couple things that we have here. Let's back up to the first tab here. Here are the assessment objectives. So when I'm doing my assessment, determining whether I think it's in place or not, I always want to keep these assessment objectives in the back of my mind in conjunction with the title. And if I have this in place, then I'll move on to the second tab here. But you also notice over here it talks about control description. So it tries to give you a little bit more information that's helpful. And then down at the bottom here, you have potential solutions. So we give you some ways that you possibly or potentially could meet this particular control. So that all helps you in formulating what we call is your evaluation or your current state. So here we have a description of how we think we're meeting this particular control. And you can read through that. I'm not going to read through it for you, but you can see that we are describing that, we have this under control. We do not allow mobile devices. They have to be approved. And they have to be monitored. So we're meeting all those assessment objectives as we move forward here. And then we have various other things. We can do a risk assessment on this. We can attach it to policies. I'll show you some of that in the next one that I do here. If I go down here to 3.2.1, let's do that in particular. You'll notice here I say it's partially in place. So in this case, I don't have it in place, but I still have to evaluate. Where am I today? So I put a description in here, and then I would go to the plan of action. This is what I plan to do, what I plan to put in place, and this is the date that I'm assigning to it. So some additional information is going back to the evaluation tab. You'll see there's a little piece here for policies. So I can attach a policy to this. So if I click on this, I would bring up a policy for this. This is the access, the awareness training policy that is in place. So we have templates for each one of the policies that you can customize
Yeah.
to meet those particular needs. In addition here then too, we can assign action items. Maybe there's an action. We want to assign something to someone to investigate. You know, maybe there's a tool that we want to look at for maintaining our records for training, or, you know, some automated process here. So we can assign that to Joe or to Rick or whomever to follow up on that. So that's kind of how we work through the tool as we go through here. But then there's other pieces of this. Once again, we can generate reports that allow us to look at various things within the database that we've actually created here. There's a dashboard that shows us the progress, where we are, how many of the controls are in place, how many partially, how many planned. So you can get the big picture here. And then the nice piece here I like is it allows you to generate your system security plan based on all that work you did. Now it automatically generates a report that you could provide to an assessor or anyone else that would have a requirement for that document. So that is kind of the whirlwind tour of our application that we have here. But you would go through every single control, and you'll notice that it lets you know the status of these as you go through as well. So I can see in a glimpse, you know, what ones are in place, what ones still need work on, and so forth. So we try to give you as much information with the potential solutions, with the additional description. We try to help make this an easy tool to use to get you where you need to be.
Well, and Maddie, if I could just add one other piece. The system that Rick's talking about is called our Core Compliance Platform, and it's used to manage all kinds of different compliance areas, from ISO 9001 to ISO 14001, which is environmental, and now NIST and CMMC. Is kind of a central all-in-one package to keep track of all your various compliance requirements. So a lot of our customers already have another certification. So, for example, they may have AS 9100 for aerospace or ISO 9001, and they've been managing things in core, all their documents and records and training and such in core for that purpose. And then along comes this new requirement. Maybe it's not so new, but maybe it's new that they're ready to address it. And so now we turn on the what we call the security suite, the core security suite, which is what Rick brought up on the screen, and that now lets you dive into CMMC, and you're making sure you can do that self-assessment and pull together the information, the artifacts that you're going to need when the assessor comes in. So I'm thinking ahead, and next year when assessments begin, you're going to have all these records. You're going to have all these things linked together. You're going to have a history of your internal self-assessments and the actions that you took. And you'll show that track record, which is a critical part of passing any assessment or audit, is showing that, you know, the progress that you've made and the improvements that you've made, and the evidence that you're today meeting one by one each of those requirements. So, you know, we are a consulting company that tries to, I guess, bring the complexity down, tries to simplify, tries to make things straightforward. I mean, just the way we're going through the discussion today, I think everyone's getting a sense that we try to avoid the mumbo jumbo of all of this. And you're going to find that whether you're working with a consultant or you're working with our tool or our training, that it's really written for, you know, the every person, the every man, the every woman, and we will make this as painless as possible and give you the level of help that you need if you do need it. But I'm really proud of the system that we have. I think it's going to be very helpful to people. We've helped, you know, well over 100 companies already through the process. And I think, you know, anyone else who would like information on the system, reach out to us afterward. And we're glad to do that. But Maddie, I feel like a proud papa sometimes.
Yeah.
And I just got to brag. So that's
Yeah.
all that was.
Yes, thank you. And I hope that helped, just seeing an example of what it kind of looks like to walk through some of those things. And there are platforms like ours and tools like ours that try to make it easier, so you're not on your own, because it can be daunting and vague. But Scott, maybe could you go over some of the main benefits of doing a self-assessment?
Yeah, Maddie, I think that's a really good way to bring this around full circle, is that the self-assessment isn't just to please the assessor, the audit, it's to give yourself and your company a running head start on getting prepared and really having an honest look at where you stand today, so you can really get after the improvements that are needed. So if any self-assessment is going to have several benefits. One is it's going to help you understand requirements. It's going to make you stop and think. It's going to make you read. It's going to make you make your own notes and prepare your questions. That absolutely helps so that you don't rush through the requirements and misunderstand things and then try to convince yourself that you're in good shape when maybe you really aren't. That's the first. The second is helping you identify gaps. Every single company that starts out on this journey is going to have gaps.
Absolutely.
Why? Because these are pretty advanced requirements. I mean, these are not things that most small businesses would normally understand or spend the time on, or, by the way, spend the money on. To get to this level of DoD compliance with cybersecurity. Some things you'll have in place, but many things you won't. And you'll really have a clear sense of what's in place, what's not in place. And then you can get after what's called remediation, which is, fixing those gaps, closing those gaps. Then you can work through the punch list. In NIST and CMMC speak, that's called your POAM, your Plan of Action and Milestone. And in fact, in the core platform, there's a report called the POAM that breaks down all your gaps and shows what actions you're taking to remediate. It also provides and creates documentation. This is a big part of any compliance, is showing the documentation and the evidence and the records. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone here. By doing your self-assessment, you're also helping to prepare for the real assessment, putting a lot of those documents in place. It also drives continual improvement. It kind of keeps the wheels turning and keeps attention and keeps focus on driving your company toward full compliance, 100% compliance, which that's the requirement. If you're doing self-assessments like is required by the NIST standard, you're doing a self-assessment at least once a year. If it were me and I were just starting out, I'd do it much more often than that. I might even break it up into parts and do a little bit every month. So again, keeps everyone's attention on the prize, if you will. And then finally, it gets you ready for that third-party certification. And you'll be able to go into that formal third-party assessment with confidence that you have things in place and you're not going to be surprised and you're not going to be caught off guard. And by the way, you're not going to have to pay for another assessment because you weren't ready.
Well, Scott, maybe could you close this off by briefly talking about how self-assessments can help a company after they've already started their CMMC preparation journey?
Yeah, so this is kind of getting to the point of many people who are in the session today who've already started this process. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have signed up for this webinar. But you've probably already kind of headed down the path. You might think you're on the right track. Maybe you don't know if you're on the right track. You want to make sure that you're doing things properly. And by the way, keeping it as affordable and efficient as possible. So if you think about this as a positive thing, not negative, it's going to go a lot further. If you think about it as being proactive, it's like getting a jump start on being ready for the assessment. You'll handle this in a similar way that you would handle an internal audit for ISO 9001 or for AS 9100 or another one of the compliance certifications you can get. And there's an internal audit process, very much like a self-assessment, that's required in those programs. So they would have you, put a plan in place before you go do the audit. So I'm kind of draw some parallels here between the ISO version of things and the NIST and CMMC version. So there's planning ahead. Then you're doing the assessment or the audit, and you're documenting what you're seeing, and you're creating notes, and you're creating reports. And one of the big documents is the assessment report that shows what was reviewed, what evidence was seen, who you spoke to, and what the outcome was, what the different details were, the findings, the gaps. And then have a closing meeting. What does that mean? Get the people together who went through the assessment with you, bring management in, and go through your audit report, kind of at a high level, but it would help everyone kind of solidify their understanding of what we need to do to really close these gaps, and then launch into corrective actions. That's where you're really putting, some thought into why did we have the problem in the first place, and what can we do about it? If, by the way, you do have an ISO or AS program in place, use your internal audit process and use your corrective action process. And by the way, use your management review process. Leverage the work you've done with your quality system to help improve your security posture and your compliance with NIST and CMMC. You'll find it's not as daunting. You're going to find it's not as confusing. And you're going to find more buy-in from your organization that's already used to the internal audits. If you're in IT, let's say you're attending today and you're in IT, maybe you haven't been involved in your ISO program, go talk to the person in charge of your ISO program, ask them how internal audits are done, and see if you can't marry these things together. It could really help a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I think that information was very, very useful. I hope you guys found it useful as well. We'll move into our Q&A section right now. We have tons of questions, so thank you guys for being so engaged. This is awesome. If we don't get to all your questions, we'll be sure to email you the answers back. So we had two people that asked, does the third-party consultant have to be a certified assessor?
Well,
Rick, do you want to just take that one? Because
Sure.
We won't get too much into acronym heaven here, but there is some acronyms here.
Yeah. So currently, the difference today is a matter of compliance. In the future, it will be certification. For certification, they do have to be certified. In compliance here, they do not have to be certified.
Yeah.
But I would definitely want somebody that was competent, that had some level of training for that assessment. Because once again, you want to jump into the weeds and so forth. But the short answer is no, they don't have to be certified. Really, there are various trainings out there today that you can look at through the Cyber AB. So there are levels of training to help people select them, but no, it doesn't have to be. It can be a consultant that is familiar with the requirements, understands the IT in nature, can help you with that third-party assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Great. One other person asked or said that they are a building construction company and none of them have expertise in community or computer security. If the government is mandating these requirements, shouldn't they foot the bill to bring us compliant?
Are you asking our opinion? Is that what's being asked?
I guess just
here?
like why aren't they footing the bill?
I think I'm on board with that.
I like
honestly.
that idea. Yeah.
I do like that idea. Unfortunately, I've not heard of that. And I think we can hold our breath if we want to, but I kind of doubt that's what's going to happen. I think the key to this is get someone who can save time for you, get someone who has some experience to provide guidance. Don't stumble your way through it, because that's a way to waste a lot of time and money. It is a challenge for most small businesses, whether you're in construction or you're in manufacturing or you're in a service company. not many people are cybersecurity experts. It's just the reality of it. So it's non-IT, non-security professionals doing a security assessment, which is tricky.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, the purpose of today's session, is to get everyone thinking more about it and what resources are out there to help. But I don't think there's a free lunch here.
Yeah,
I hate to
that
say
would
it.
be nice. We have another question. This person said, CMMC Level 1 requirements seem straightforward, but I'm concerned about missing details. Do you have a self-assessment guide or tool addressing just Level 1?
There is a assessment guide for Level 1. So Maddie's going to send you guys the link to the CMMC assessment guide for Level 2. If you look on that same page on the DoD website, there's an assessment guide for Level 1. And that would be very useful if Level 1 certification is what you're preparing for. That is an important point, because if you're working towards certification with Level 1, it's only a self-assessment. There won't be a third-party assessment involved. But that means that the burden is more on the company and the individuals ensuring that compliance is in place to get it right. But I would use 171A and just go to the appropriate controls there and use the assessment guide for Level 1.
This is another great question. What changes are expected to the NIST 800/CMMC in the coming year? Should we wait on major documentation until such changes are released?
That's a great question. Well, there's two aspects to this. And one of the aspects is that the NIST 800/171 Revision 2 is the law of the land today. It is a requirement. And you are required to meet that today. So if you plan to do any kind of DoD work, yes, you need to be compliant with that, which means you want to create your documentation on that. So that's what we know today, that is here and it's going to be here for a while. Regardless what happens with CMMC, we know that's going to be a future thing, and the DoD will get due diligence done when they get it done. Nobody here knows when that would be. But once again, we're not held to the CMMC, but we are held to the NIST 800/171 Revision 2 today.
And that's
now, Rick, people might have heard that NIST 800/171 Revision 2 is even now being revised.
Yes.
Which makes it even more confusing. Keep in mind, we won't get too much into the weeds here, but the NIST document is published by NIST, not by the DoD. It's published by NIST. It's for government-wide use. Okay, so it's not written specifically for DoD. DoD happens to be using it as the foundation for CMMC certification. But NIST is its own standalone department within the federal government. They can revise the document anytime they want. It just so happens they planned to revise it this year into next. So they're in the process right now of getting comments on Revision 3. It was originally, I think the timing was originally planned that CMMC would already be out. People would already be getting certified. And then NIST would be revised. It sort of looks like it's going to be the reverse. However, there's been no indication that when the CMMC certifications begin next year, that they're going to expect Revision 3. I don't see how they would do it, because they've been spending years preparing everyone and certifying their assessors with Level 2 or Version 2, Revision 2. To all of a sudden flip that around at the last minute and say, no, wait a minute, now we got to retrain everybody to Revision 3. I think that pushes everything out even further. I don't believe that will happen, but you can't quote me on that. Right now, Level 2 or Revision 2 of NIST is, as Rick said, the law of the land, and it's where your focus should be. I wouldn't get distracted with the Revision 3 stuff. I think it's a way to kick the can down the road if you want another reason to do it. I mean, everyone's been kicking the can down the road anyway. So if they want another reason, I guess you could call this your next reason. I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you try to get, wait and to see what's going to happen there. You're going to get behind, and then you won't be prepared.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Scott, is you don't want to get too far behind.
Yeah.
Regardless of what happens in the future, you want to stay as current as you can, because then the lift, if it does change, is not going to be as heavy.
Yeah.
Plus, you need to secure that information. You don't want to say, "Oh, I'll get that next year," and then you get hacked and that information gets stolen because you didn't do due diligence. So stay as current as you can. And once again, the provisional wisdom out there is that it's going to stay with the revision 2 for a while.
Okay. Sweet. Also, I think a lot of people have a lot of questions about cost. We had one question, one sort of comment on cost. One person asked, what are the estimated costs for these certifications? Is there an estimate?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just take that quickly, Betty. First thing I'll say is I know we have a whole session, a whole webinar scheduled later this year to go through the costs. So stay tuned for that. Look at the website. You'll see the schedule there. At least I think it's there. But there's cost from 3 angles. The question might be, what is the assessor going to charge? Well, that's hard to say because assessment haven't really begun.
Yeah.
But everything I have heard and read tells me is probably 3 times the cost of an ISO certification.
Okay.
At least. It's much more expensive than, and I'm talking about CMMC Level 2.
Yeah.
So budgeting for this is really important. Passing it the first time is really important. Secondly, you're going to spend money on remediation. So whatever your gaps are, there's going to be time and money spent to address those things. It's really important that you understand the requirements clearly and you know your options. By the way, there's not just one way to do things. You know your options that might be best suited for your company to meet those requirements, so you can keep the whole thing as affordable as possible. And then thirdly, I guess I'm working backward in time here, is training and consultation. Companies will go out and get help from a provider like Core to provide assistance, and there can be expenses around that. Maybe there's a fourth piece, which is everybody's time and anguish.
Yeah.
Whatever price you put on that.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, that's all of our time for today. I know there are some questions that we didn't get to, but we will be emailing those answers out along with those resources that Scott mentioned, and of course a recording of the webinar today so you can go back and review any information that you'd like. We want to thank you for joining us today as we discussed how to prepare for CMMC self-assessments. We hope that you feel more confident in how to conduct your CMMC self-assessment and get prepared. Members of our consulting team are available to help you better prepare for CMMC. Our experts are able to help you lay out a plan for CMMC and get all your sensitive information secured. If you're interested in more information about our CMMC programs for small business or our core compliance platform, please contact us at info@thecoresolution.com. We want to thank again all of our co-sponsors for promoting our webinar today and taking part in sharing this important information about CMMC. I would also like to take just a brief moment to share some more information about Apex Accelerators. Apex Accelerators are here to bridge a gap between your business and government. They're funded by federal and state resources or sources. They serve businesses of all kinds with government contracts to help you get government contracts. It's a nationwide program with 94 centers and approximately 630 counselors. You'll see in the next slide here, it's a map of all the Apex Accelerators in Pennsylvania, specifically if you happen to live in Pennsylvania. Apex Accelerators can help you with vendor registrations and certifications, identifying government markets and specific contracting opportunities, and so much more. They changed their name to Apex Accelerators in 2022. It's a new funding source, but it's all the same services to the clients and communities. You can find your local Apex Accelerator at www.apptech-us.org, and here's a slide with all of the Pennsylvania Apex Accelerators that you can reach out to get more information. Finally, next month we will be having a webinar on how to prepare a CMMC system security plan. This webinar will explain how to build a comprehensive SSP that addresses all the requirements for CMMC certification. Please join us on Thursday, July 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to learn more about CMMC SSPs. As we wrap up, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and let us know if you have any more questions from today's session or would like any more information about any of our CMMC programs. Take care.